Now, good afternoon and welcome. It's Godfrey Mutizwa here. Now, Africa is a continent under construction with more than a third of projects taking place in Southern Africa. Welcome to CNBC Africa's third Building Africa panel discussion. Now, today we are discussing infrastructure, in particular the deficit in Southern Africa and what is being done to fix it. Let me introduce to you my guests. We've got Brunhilde Barnard. She is an infrastructure leader at EY. We also have Mohale Rakgate, he's General Manager for Project Preparation at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Raoul Gamsu is going to join us later. He's CEO, Consolidated Infrastructure Group. But in the studio, Lullu Krugel, Chief Economist at KPMG South Africa, is here. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you.
I think let's begin with a broad discussion of where we are in terms of that infrastructure funding gap. I think we've got the figure for Africa, and I don't know if that figure remains relevant. I remain to be corrected and updated. But the figure I have is $100 billion every single year. That is not provided for. That should be there for infrastructure funding in Africa. What about in Southern Africa? Can I begin with you, Lullu?
Godfrey, I think we've definitely seen that there's been strain on funding for infrastructure, mainly because of the economic slowdown. If we just look at most of the economies around or in the Southern African region, the estimates are to stimulate proper economic growth that you should see infrastructure expenditure and investment in the region of about 10% of GDP. And in most countries at this point in time, it's fallen below 1%. And it means that we are looking at growth rates in future of 15 to 18% if we want to make that up. So it's tough. It's not easy at the moment because of some of the economies growing slower.
Which is the next part of my question, because if you say that you need to spend on infrastructure in order to spur economic growth, and we do know that politicians do like economic growth because it provides jobs for the people that will elect them. It seems pretty clear to me that that's what should be focusing on. What are the problems? Just frame them a little bit.
It's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, because I am a proponent of it that infrastructure is in fact a catalyst for economic growth, and there shouldn't be a long-term focus on that to be the source of economic growth. So there's some basic things that we need to get right to attract investment. To make sure that investors are happy to invest. If I think about some of the clients that we've worked with, they're often saying that the necessity of some basic infrastructure makes a big difference between a decision to invest or not.
Sure.
So at this point in time, looking at that gap, we will have to be creative and see how we can work with private sector to actually fund that, because governments
Is that the missing part?
Yes, there's a couple of models that we can look at, but that's definitely one of the areas. So how do we get private sector to also pick up part of that investment and to make it worth their while to do that?
Absolutely, and we know that a large part of it is funding. From your perspective, Mohale, is the money there?
Yeah, the money is there when projects are prepared, well scoped and feasibility studies completed. You'll always have, your funders, either from the commercial banks or even institutional investors, willing to come in through the pension funds and so forth to contribute to the funding. The appetite is not lacking in that regard. The challenge is more on the preparation side. You have funders, queuing, looking for projects that are well prepared, which have got good governance around them. So that's where we come in as DBSA with our project preparation business, to work with governments to de-risk these projects and make sure that they reach a point where they can attract funding.
You sound like you are saying that the projects that are required to be done, we know them, but there is no expertise in terms of preparation, which seems to be suggesting that you are getting more work than you can handle because you are the ones who prepare for the projects, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I can't handle it. I'm still able to.
You're picking and choosing.
Yeah, and we've got a criteria that we use to prioritize.
Is it difficult to build that criteria and then sell it together with the projects?
Yeah, I think in the past few years we have managed to establish relationships with the regional economic communities. We're talking about Southern Africa now, so we're working very closely with SADC, for example. We know there are regional infrastructure development master plan, which prioritizes the projects that would result in regional integration. So we take cue from that, and in consultation and in partnership with SADC, we mobilize funding for preparation. We have the SADC development and preparation facility that we manage on behalf of SADC at DBSA. So we use, amongst others, that funding to then, de-risk these projects, do feasibility studies, get advisors on board, and eventually at the point when they reach, a point when, you have bankable feasibility studies, there's no lack of funding from investors, either on the equity side, especially if it's the type of projects that are done off balance sheet, like triple P projects and so forth. So you'll have guys coming in to both fund equity and operate, implement and operate. And you'll have the debt providers also queuing up to contribute debt. So from our point, the gap is really on the preparation side.
Absolutely. I was going to come back to you and talk a little bit more about how hard a sell it is for you to get that money. But let me come to you because you specialize on energy, and we know energy is the big driver. And now when we talk energy, we have to talk about, some people keep saying it is the big elephant, but it's almost like a lot of elephants that are in the region. And we know that when it comes to regional developments around power, we have failed. Inga remains a pipe dream in the air. What is the problem with fixing the energy needs of Southern Africa?
It's a complex question, and it will have a complex answer. For me, and if I can just build on what Mohale was saying and Lullu was saying, it's about the ecosystem. It's the ecosystem of economic growth, it's the ecosystem of funding and project readiness, and then it's the ecosystem of enabling environments for regulatory environments. Now, some of the challenge we have for the regional projects, be it energy, be it transport, be it water even, it's whether the regulatory environment is coordinated and harmonious. And sometimes—
Are you pointing a finger at SADC? In part, because that's where the coordination ought to begin, right?
Does SADC have all the wherewithal and the capacity to create that harmonization?
Big question.
And that is what we need. So it's a question of capacity, and of course there's always this trade-off between sovereign interest and regional interest and national interest. Now if you look at all the projects that are really moving forward, is the ones that address the national interest. And of course, because it's and again, I think this is agnostic as to whether it's power or transport or water. It's the national interest first because of the deficit. And Inga, in time, given the scale, it may well be too ambitious, and we know that the evacuation is significant and troublesome. But for me, it's around the ecosystem, and we're talking confidence. I mean, as an economist, confidence. Confidence that long-term contracts will prevail. Confidence that political support will remain. DBSA would speak to that. And confidence that the underlying commodity cycles, for example, will support offtake. So
I attended a conference, and you attended that conference as well in Mauritius, where someone was suggesting that perhaps what we need is not a lot of these big Ingas. We need a lot of little Ingas. So small, bankable projects that we take to the market that are less complex and therefore require less political maneuvering in order to be able to get them off the ground.
But also speed to implementation. I mean, I think you will agree with me that the bubble in terms of project pipeline is all in planning feasibility stage. What we need actually is them to be commissioned.
Absolutely. Talking about speed, there's a guy who's just entered the studio. His name is Raoul Gamsu. He's CEO, Consolidated Infrastructure Group. And you have speed in the private sector, we always say. And the private sector, in many instances, moves faster than governments can. When you look around Southern Africa, we're talking about the funding gap and the challenges around filling in that funding gap around infrastructure in Southern Africa. What are you finding are the main challenges when you go around looking for business?
Yeah, so clearly, I think what we're seeing is where there's policy certainty, then everything else will line up behind it. So I'm going to kind of be critical now. The REAP program, fantastic program, brilliantly executed, well done, international investors, and now you kind of got two stakeholders going in, pulling in different directions, destroying an industry. So I think we need to see certainty, and then the private sector will find the gaps to make it happen. But if the policy certainty or government delays or the funders won't come, the investors won't stay, foreign capital disappears, and then you kind of smart people leave.
Sure.
So
Now,
that's the issue.
when you say the lack of policy certainty is not there, is that for the whole region, or is that the bigger boys, or is that some of the smaller countries, or is that at the level of SADC itself, which, as we were discussing earlier, is supposed to be coordinating everything?
No, certainly I kind of agree earlier about the national imperatives. Nationalism comes first. Every single country, particularly now, is acting in their own framework. I mean, we're again mostly power-based across the continent, and what we're seeing is a move away from supporting your neighbours.
Sure.
Some of the consequences of, let's just say, load shedding in Eskom.
Yeah.
Our neighbours today are all building their own infrastructures and want to be independent, irrespective of a SADC development.
Absolutely. Lullu, if I can come to you, because when we speak about the need to try to get this regional consensus going and getting everybody to buy into this bigger vision that looks at a region, from the economic perspective, it makes sense to have a bigger market. Yes. Why is it so difficult for the politicians to look at a regional perspective as opposed to the national perspective, when there are enough examples? When you look, for instance, at East Africa and the progress that they are making in terms of integration, you look even at West Africa, despite their problems and terrorism and everything else, they seem a little far ahead of SADC. SADC, which has perhaps a greater base and a better base than all these other regions. Yeah,
theoretically, I think we should have a lot more. We actually have a lot more in common than some of the East African countries. But ironically, we're struggling, as Brunhilde said earlier, harmonization does play a big role. If you just think about simple things, if you want to move goods across borders, how long it takes you and how costly it is. So if you're trying to do a cross-border project, it becomes expensive as well. Mostly, I think we've seen a very big focus back on reindustrialization, localization of economies. And whilst in principle, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We can't all do everything ourselves, and we need to look at what can you do, what can I do.
Sure.
If we think about the IPP program, for example, that we have in South Africa, a big part of that is localization and local content. But we probably don't have sustainable demand to build all the big wind turbines that is needed here, but they might be in the rest of the region. So it's about who's best to do that. And I'm excited to say that there are certain sectors where we're hearing the right noises, but it takes a bit of time to get it right.
I want to pick up on one of the words that was used earlier. I can't remember who amongst you said it. They spoke about governance around these projects, and I think I need to come back to you, Mohale, because I want to understand how big an issue is that, and I also want you to explain what it is, so that perhaps we can get the man, because he's the one I think who would battle with problems around governance and making sure that he gets his back.
Sure. I think governance it can be very broad, but in simple terms, when you're looking at infrastructure, is the legislative and regulatory framework around projects. In South Africa with the RIP, for example, you have a regime where government would go out and invite private parties to come and make proposals for wind and solar projects. So, and there's certainty around that. That, or there should be certainty around that. But there has been over the past 5 years until recently, for reasons that have been explained. So that's what you need, and you want transparency. If a tender is issued out, you want transparency around the evaluation, how they select the preferred bidder, and so forth. And beyond that, you want to ensure that even if governments change, the certainty, the contract will survive any new government that might come in place, around tariffs, around the contractual arrangements, and so forth. And it can be broader to include even, whether the economic and political situation sustains, the projects themselves. And, it's a challenge, because if you look at the region, something like the RIP program is not something that has been done. If you look at the power sector, it's largely being done on unsolicited basis. So a private sector developer would, on a unsolicited basis, approach government. So again, that enhances the level of risk associated with that, as opposed to government developing a regulatory certain framework to say, private sector come in a transparent way.
Absolutely.
But despite that, if I may add, you find that even in some countries within the region, Zambia is an example, they've done, successfully power projects on an unsolicited bid basis. So you have, even within that environment, some certainty and confidence, associated with that.
Absolutely.
So those are some of the, issues that we deal with, even, in different regimes.
Absolutely. I think we are approaching another elephant. The other elephant you're approaching is corruption, because that's a big part of the problem, isn't it? Okay, so we do know that there are these problems. I think let's park them a little bit aside. Let's talk a little bit about the other one that is within the purview of the private sector, where most of you guys come from. How hard is it to find the money to fund these projects? Can I begin with you quickly again, and then we can go through the others?
Yeah. As I said earlier, from our experience, and the RIP program is a classical example. We have been involved with it as DBSA from the initiation, working with the DOE and the National Treasury. So when we started, there was nothing. But once, the system was set up, it has attracted close to 200 billion rands.
Sure.
Because, it was well, set up within a very certain framework. There was no shortage of, foreign and local investors to put that money in. So from our point of view, as I emphasize, when we have, those projects or programs, put in place, ready for implementation, there's lots of idle cash. South Africa is being spoken about as having, an investment strike, where there's lots of cash reserves, which are looking for investment destination. So that's not an issue. The issue is on the preparatory side, the throughput of bankable projects.
Sure.
Yeah.
I do think, to link on to what Mohale has said, there's in South Africa alone, I was a little bit bored the other day, and I checked the balance sheets of some of the biggest entities in South Africa.
There's a big number that's being bandied around, 600 billion rand.
It is actually, it's between 650 and 700 if you just look at the JSE listed entities.
And we're not talking about the other private companies that are out there sitting on their own cash as well.
But that is probably close to what is out there. Having said that, I do think we realize that specifically in South Africa, we've seen we've seen quite a good stream of infrastructure investment over the last couple of years, and it's been good for our economy, especially during the financial downturn.
Sure.
But it has also led to a situation where we've seen government debt increasing. Now, there's various versions or reasons for that, and although I think the funding is there and the money is there, where people are getting concerned, and as taxpayers we might get a little bit frustrated, is how these projects are managed at the end of the day. We see massive cost escalation. We're asking ourselves questions why, and on the back of that we've seen debt increasing. So I think there's definitely something to be said about better managing the funding that is available.
Absolutely. So maybe we should get government out of the whole equation, shouldn't we? And just look at the private money, because when you look at the private money, like he says, she says, you are looking at what, 650 to 700 billion. As I said, you can add other billions as well from the private sector.
Well, I think it's a triangulated relationship.
Sure.
Again, not to hop on the REIPPP, but it is absolutely an example of where government came out with a stated intention to do a program. The then Minister of Energy, Honourable Minister Peters, made a statement that it's going to be a robust program. And we've been, there was a strong statement about bidders that were unsuccessful that said, even though we were not successful, we believed in the outcome for the transparency, for the robustness of it. So government creating the platform, capital responding, jobs being created, economic development being kickstarted.
And then what happened?
A pause, I would hope.
Bureaucrats. Bureaucrats.
No, but I mean, so what do we have? we've got some uncertainty. Is it policy uncertainty or is it stakeholder uncertainty? I think it is a pause. I don't think in my view, the integrated resource plan has now been issued. There's consultation. In fact, by issuing it, it's open to the debate and is moving forward.
Sure, 100%. Are you sitting on some cash?
Yeah.
You are?
So, not 650 billion.
Okay, it's but the 650 billion.
Where we're missing, and I want to just say, the world is awash in capital at the moment, all looking for yield. And certainly the continent provides yield. And if you look, the rating agencies, and I don't recall which one, put out a report. The default rate on the African continent is less than 1% default rate. Okay, which tells you we're taking on too many, just too tightly banked projects, and we're not doing enough of them. I mean, I think the US is the highest.
Are you suggesting it should be higher?
No, yes. I mean, you can't have lenders globally kind of turning around and saying, oh, well, there's only a 1% default rate. I think in Southeast Asia it was 7 or 8%, in the US 11.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. 1%, 99% of all projects.
Your money is guaranteed, almost.
So then we should be doing more.
Yes.
So, and there is global capital out there. I think that we are within all the funding mechanisms that are there. We're too slow in that funding cycle. But there is definitely capital availability globally, in South Africa, and it just needs kind of the right certainty to drive growth. Yeah. And critically, every one of the stakeholders are party to it. It's not you can't do this on your own. And the world changes. 2 years or beginning of this year, I think if one of us would have done a captive power project with some of the mining houses, I don't think you would have got a 12-year PPA because of their credit rating.
Sure.
It's 9 months later, a bit of commodity price increases, and it looks completely different. So, I think we're just too tough, I think, on ourselves and on what our requirements are.
Yeah.
And we're not pushing hard enough to bring in international capital.
Where's the problem?
So I think part of the problem is that we are seen globally. I'm not saying, so South Africa's on an investment strike, and I don't blame them. Part of the problem then is that we are seen as corrupt. We're seen as corrupt. The market perception, the global perception is, well, are we any different to corruption in any other parts of the continent or some of our peer groups in South America? And you know what? Why go and invest there? Because you just don't, let's call it, if it has been a corrupt project,
sure,
no one gets paid, there will be default and there will be issues. If the governance is appropriate, everyone will feel comfortable in what's happening, like the REAP program. It's been done, and it's, we can't hide from what's going on.
Absolutely. I'm sensing silence in the room here.
Yeah. No, I just want to add to the point that, in our view, the REAP program has not stopped. Maybe it has taken a pause.
You found ways around the challenges.
I think it will come back, especially, as the integrated resource plan was issued.
Yes.
And if you look at it, it still has confidence on the IPPs in general, not just, the renewable side. It has got, gas in there.
Yeah.
It's got coal IPPs, so in our view, and that is the policy policy document of government. It guides what government would do. So between now and March, when it should be finalized, one hopes that the finalized document will come definitively to say, this, IPP programs will continue.
Sure.
And there will be certainty in the market. That's our hope and how we see it, panning out.
Sure. You want to come in quickly?
I'd love to come in on just one point. And I understand, and we're calling it a pause, but we've built quite a substantial renewable energy business on the transmission side, on the electrification of wind farms and solar parks. And regrettably, the world doesn't stand still for pauses. So you're now having competition for homegrown talent. We've spent 5 years developing talent to service that sector. And okay, fortunately in our case it's internal competition, but right now we've got a pipeline of 22 projects outside South Africa, and I've got competition where they're saying, let's take our engineers and our skills we've developed in SA and let's go do projects in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda and Ethiopia. And South Africa is at very real risk of losing 5 years of development. So I think it's great and well and wonderful that the state wants to intervene and pause, but private sector is not standing still, and the guys, and I know of distinctive, some of our competitors have been retrenching people because of this pause.
Absolutely.
In a market where if it changes on the 1st of April or 2nd of April and demand then exceeds supply once again, you have to rehire, retrain, reskill, and it's really kind of, you're playing with people's lives, and it's regrettable.
Absolutely. So the world is an open village and these guys are moving around. We are discussing the infrastructure funding problems that we find in Southern Africa and on the African continent. When we come back after the break, I want us to perhaps move a little beyond what we've been discussing so far, because these guys are threatening to make this a simple debate. There's one problem. It is because of the politics stupid, as they said in America. Well, we want to talk about nimbler and perhaps cleverer ways of riding the challenges that we are seeing in Southern Africa. But that's after the break. Welcome back. We are live from the JSE and we are discussing ways of fixing the infrastructure funding deficit in Southern Africa. And still with me in the studio is Brunhilde Barnard. She's infrastructure leader at EY. Mohale Rakgate, general manager for project preparation and development, Bank of Southern Africa. And Raoul Gamsu, CEO of Consolidated Infrastructure Group. And Lullu Krugel, chief economist at KPMG in South Africa. Now, we know that infrastructure is vital to investor and rating agency confidence. Let's take a look at what South Africa's Minister of Economic Development, Ibrahim Patel, had to say on the matter.
Strengthening our investment in infrastructure. Last year when I was at Davos, the one question that foreign investors asked us is, can you undertake that we will have access to a reliable supply of energy if we come into South Africa and invest here? And we're looking for a 10-15 year commitment on energy. And you've got an energy shortage as a country. So infrastructure matters to them. And over the next 3 years, we will be spending close to R1 trillion in infrastructure investment. In fact, 987 billion rand will be invested in energy, in water, in transport, logistics, and in some social infrastructure. So that's part of the story we tell the investors. It's part of what we do in our own economy, and it's part of when we look back 6 months or a year from now, this is where we're going to measure ourselves. Can we get this money into infrastructure?
I don't know how many times I've heard about this R1 trillion that's waiting to be spent and how the private sector has been waiting for so long to spend this money. We are discussing perhaps faster and cleverer ways of making us spend this money. Lulu, can I start with you? Can't we be a little cleverer and nimbler and perhaps innovative in the way we approach these funding projects? Should we still go to the old IPPs? And because when you look around the region, all of the governments, and I'm saying all of them advisedly, I think, don't have the money. So how can we construct mechanisms and models that better perhaps are able to use this 650, 700 billion rand into this need that we know is desperate?
So I agree with you. Yes, there might not be, all of the funding might not be in government, and a lot of the project management skills and other skills might be in private sector. But to make a lot of these projects work from an economic standpoint, you do need government,
Sure.
input and involvement in the process. Where I've heard, and I mean, I stand to be corrected, I don't deal with the sector myself, I look from it as an economist and from an economic perspective, is that a lot of private sector companies are saying that they're frustrated at the pace at which procurement decisions are made.
Procurement.
Yes, at the rate at which decisions are made in government. If you see, for example, tenders are being issued, the people that need to make those decisions are not necessarily people with the correct technical and project management skills to say, these are the right guys, we should go with it that way. So there's also there's different views out there as
Sure.
to why it's happening. Some people will say corruption plays a role.
I was
do
going to
think it
say
does.
procurement stroke corruption.
It does, but there's also, make no mistake, there's also a lot of good people out there that maybe feel very worried at this point in time. If I make this decision, you know, what will the repercussions be? So it's about empowering the right people to make quick decisions. From a technical perspective, I suppose sometimes you know, and again, I'm not a project expert, but some of these projects by their nature is quite complex and intricate, and and you have to go that route for it to make economic sense. So it's about finding the balance between the things that we can do quickly and fast, and then how do we manage those big things. But it seems that a lot of the delay seems to happen during the procurement stages.
Brunhilde, I'm sorry to do this to you, but one of your competitors talks about complexity, making it simple, or some such, or something like along those lines. And I'm thinking when you're hearing things like those, you must be, at least within the big four at least, be saying, hello, here's the opportunity, because that's what you guys deal with. Surely, why are you not running and offering these services to government? And I'll come to you as well, because the African Development Bank has a lot of expertise around these areas, and I've heard them say they want to help government. So I'm coming to you.
No, clearly. I mean, there is a whole private sector standing ready to support government in executing.
The contracts are not coming.
It's the decision making. And it's the decision making around political uncertainty, 17 elections across the continent this year. We know that the decision making cycle slows down. Government may or may not change, and then the new government needs to bed down. And if we look, for example, the delays in bedding down the new government in Nigeria, for how long that took cabinet appointments.
Well, there's no bedding down there.
But the point, case in point, isn't it? It's not a textbook example. It's absolutely there. So it's the decision making, and to your point, skills, but also capacity. You know, if you look and you do a head count on the PPP units in ministries of finance across the continent, it's small teams more than the projects. But I want to just put something on the table. If you look to the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital that came on stream this week, first concept was 2007. A private sector initiative. A private sector initiative, to my understanding, being driven all the time forward. 10 years in gestation, from concept to opening.
So you can be sure that the first dollar that was available is not the same dollar that is built it now.
But the point is, this is to the scale of the ambition of the project, of the sophistication. This is the life. I mean, from a private sector perspective as well.
You would have gone away and made tons and tons of money.
So, I mean, you said 10 years to completion of what is a very simple project.
But from concept, so what I'm saying, from project concept to completion, it took that private sector team. And I'm saying it speaks to the complexity of raising the funding, of getting all the component parts aligned.
Mohale, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I want to concur with the message around capacity, support.
That's where the problem is.
Yeah, in addition to funding for the early stages of project development, you have capacity support as a major issue. I mean, the 1 trillion that the minister is referring to has got to do with both economic and social infrastructure. Part of that is to be spent by municipalities and provinces and so forth. And the issue there is around whether those municipalities have got the
capacity,
to plan and prepare and implement, and more importantly also maintain, thereafter operate and maintain. And again, not punting my own organization, it's another gap that we have identified. We playing a role in the planning stages, and also embedding support into the counterparties that we're dealing with, because otherwise we don't have capacity that you can interact with and ensure that projects are smoothly implemented. And another dimension that we're looking at is that whilst the RIP program might have paused in South Africa, there are other interested countries within the region. I won't mention the names that we're chatting to, talking to seriously to replicate the RIP program in those countries. And the issue there again, they are partnering with us because they know very well that they don't have the capacity. Even in South Africa, this was done outside the government department, being DOE. A special office was set up, being the IPP office, because it was realized that you needed specialized, dedicated skills and expertise to make it work.
So the politicians need to make the decision to find the right people. And that's where our problems are.
Or acknowledge, in fact, more importantly, acknowledge that there's a gap.
Yeah.
Because that's the first step towards addressing that.
One example I can give you also is, of course, the Beitbridge border post number 1.
Yeah.
And then I passed there a couple of days ago. I spent 4 hours at that border post being rudely spoken to by the immigration officials, the customs officials, on both sides of the divide, by the way. And this is something that you replicate even if you go as further high as the DRC, etc., etc., etc. So the question then becomes, can't we do something about that? Where is the African Development Bank in all of this? Where is the World Bank? Why are they not coming in and offering the technical assistance and the project funding that's required to try to move organizations like yours a little faster so that you are then able to help those down the line?
Yeah, I concur with you, and it's one of our focus areas, the so-called one-stop border posts, because, if you were to create those, you really, bring in efficiencies in transportation of both goods and people and services, and again, the challenge there is around sovereignty, because you've got 2 or at least 2 governments involved. The issue is around who's going to be responsible. And it has been done elsewhere in the world, where you need to set up one authority, by legislation. Again, it's cumbersome. But I think for us, I mean, at least from our point of view, what you need is the intention, the willingness of governments to do it. Because once you have that, processes will unfold, and that's where agencies like ourselves, DBSA, and you mentioned other institutions can come in. But up until governments, don't realize, realize that, this is important, it's going to be a challenge.
When I was doing the research for this program in the morning, I just remembered again, when you contrast East and Southern Africa, and you look at the politicians who are there, I was looking at 2 politicians here in Southern Africa who have been in power for 86 years or thereabouts, I think. Dare I mention names? Zimbabwe, we know 36 years. Dos Santos next door has got another 37 years, etc. And I think that becomes part of the problem. But we know perhaps there's very little we can do about that until, the governance systems are improved. Let's talk a little bit more about what we can do. The models that we have currently, are they sufficient? Or do we need to be a little cleverer in how we use these models, given the lessons that we took out of the Gauteng Freeway project here, where I know people here are complaining about that. I said hallelujah, because I love driving all the way from the airport right down to Rudeport or wherever that is. And yet when you go across the continent, you will not find such a luxury. How do we play the politics right in structuring these models so that we don't have the problems that we have here, but we showcase it as something that works, and then perhaps take it across the continent to places like Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia? I'm with you.
If I may come in there.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I can come in with regards to that, especially when you're talking about the road transportation side of things. I think, we did a project in Zimbabwe, with a South African company, toll road, to the extent that you bring in new infrastructure, it's new and people had no option before. I think there's an appreciation. We're looking at other countries in the region from a preparation point of view.
Did it take you a long time, though, to put that project together?
No, it was normal. It wasn't out of the ordinary. It was
anyway,
long,
you need to do more work so you can. I understand.
So with the other countries, we are replicating the same model. In fact, one of the projects we are looking at is cross-border, between Zambia and DRC. You've got governments on both sides, willing to work together. And we mobilize funding from our partners for up to $5 million to do preparation for that. Because, there's a realization from both governments that this is going to unlock, the regional integration, trade, and so forth between, the 2 countries. So I think there's a buy-in in that sense. I think our own project in Gauteng has got its own dynamics, and one wouldn't want to dwell deeply into them. I mean, issues like...
But there must be important lessons that we can pick up from
I think one of them, which is acknowledged by even the promoters of the project, is that there wasn't sufficient consultation. Yeah, but from our point, at least myself, I see great value in the freeway system.
Projects like those.
Yeah, and I have my e-tag on my car. Because just from an economic point of view, it used to take me an hour to get to work. Now it takes me 30 minutes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I can count the rand and cents, and it makes sense from my own little budget.
Absolutely, Raoul.
Yeah, I wanted to add. I think that if we go back to your original question around the blockages, and there is certainly tender processes do take time, and over the last 10 years it's extended out significantly. So what used to be, the guys would have a 90-day on the smaller projects, and they would extend by 30. It's now 90-day, or it's 180, and then they extend by 180. So your pipeline potential looks so much better, but the cycle's that much longer. But let's put that aside as one issue. The other one is, I think that there are so much complex. There isn't any standardization on financing agreements, on guarantees that are looked for.
Why not?
I don't know. I mean, I just everyone is, the lawyers and bankers and consultants are kind of getting rich off the cycle, whereas you could actually streamline it if you turned around and you said, right, for a project of this nature, these are the standard terms and conditions. These are the terms and conditions on the financing.
At a regional level, which then
either regional, even a national level. But instead of every single contract into like extensive negotiations with bankers, with funders, with what the guarantee wording looks like for days, and then every country has their own view of what they can take and what they can't. I think it's a huge amount of just legal blockage and financial system blockage.
Yeah, and one of the things, you mentioned it now, that I think we ought to talk about as well, is the whole issue around the cost of some of these projects, because this is a government document that I came across which talks about lack of low-cost access to information and communication technologies as one problem, and the other one is highly priced, unpredictable transport and logistics services, especially for landlocked states. Do we have a problem with pricing these projects? Are we pricing ourselves really out of the market here? That's why the politicians are hesitant. Everybody, please, let's come in. You need to think about it because you're charging.
So if I could kick off. So if you look to the pricing, and again, not to harp on the renewable energy program, but it has been scale. It's absolutely utility scale and significant and first of kind in this region. The pricing came down. So why did the pricing came down? Because initially of the uncertainty around the program, it was new and there was a lot of learning, and it's well acknowledged that the bankers even had to get their minds around project financing long-term assets. So there was a learning and belt and braces, to your point, and slow process in first closings, if you recall. But the learning does happen, and the learning in the technologies does happen. And the reduction in price was not only about component pricing coming down, but because of efficiency and the developer throughput.
New technologies.
So new technologies coming through, but also, again, the human capital learning. If you know what I'm saying, the better pricing of risk, both by the banks and the EPCs and the equity providers, to be clear. So, are we pricing, or are we doing new cycles all the time, and then you've got the learning premium?
Right.
I would welcome your.
I think one of the things that we've seen in a lot of the IPP projects as well is that the parties involved, and particularly from government side, and I'm not trying to come up for government and slate private sector here, but it's something that private sector has more experience in. So in terms of those risk negotiations, it's really tricky sometimes. And to the point of what Brunhilde said, over time, as we see more and more of those projects being successful, I don't think we should write PPPs off and say, listen, it's not working. It's just about, exactly to your point as well, how can we standardize some of those things? How can we make it a little bit easier? How can we learn lessons from it? We do get pricing wrong. I think we've seen in South Africa how some of these costs escalate. It comes into the planning phases, it comes into the management. There's so many different things that play a role, the capacity, etc. But instead of saying, okay, we see this project in isolation, we leave that alone. There should be more sharing of information between projects.
Why is it not happening?
I think another dimension. South Africa is an outlier in the sense that we have the PFMA,
the Public Finance Management
Act, which talks to competitive bidding. So as a result, you're likely to get a price which is competitive because you have, an open
transparent
process.
way of arriving at it. Yeah.
But if you look beyond South Africa in the region, you don't have such a regime. It tends to be, as I said earlier, unsolicited arrangements. A private sector approaches government with a proposal, and eventually a deal is made. That's where there's a risk of overpricing. And what it calls for, especially for the likes of ourselves who would be potential funders, is to ensure that the contractual arrangements are fair and balanced, because otherwise they won't be sustainable. A 20-year contract will last 3 years. New government comes in, as we have seen in other countries, they'll review those contracts. So it's in everyone's interest, even private sector, to ensure that when they enter into such deals, they are fair and balanced.
Sure.
Not to be greedy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you want to come in before we talk about the role of SADC? Because I'm getting the sense here perhaps there's work that needs to be done at the SADC level that's not being done.
So I think there's a history of distrust, quite rightly so. I think that there's been collusion between bidders.
Yes, we know about the construction industry
there's
here.
been collusion between bidders. It's a history, and it's gone on for decades. And reciprocally, the buyer of that doesn't trust, and quite rightly so. So, everyone takes more time and looks at it, with greater scrutiny. So I think that's an issue, and we need to be more robust and the system needs to be more robust in being ruthless on collusive practices. The next is kind of, you have to shift, and I'm just giving you a sense of being more allocating responsibility, in my view, to the private sector.
Sure.
So you're saying if you're going turnkey, you've got to say, right, well, you're taking responsibility, private sector, for building this toll road or building whatever, deliver it.
Right.
You can't have a situation, I think you see a lot of it, well, you're going to build it, but then in between we decide, well, maybe we should have this deviation or this variation or this move, or maybe we need this boiler manufacturer. So like that, the guys have to get on and deliver to the price.
Sure.
So I think,
which talks to the lack of trust that you're talking about, because that's key now in order to, for those who are asking for these projects to then give you the responsibility to say, here's a turnkey project.
Well, I think that's it. So go turnkey instead of going this route, and shift the responsibility for delivery to the private sector. Instead of kind of some of these big, let's say the big Eskom builds. I mean, we all know what is it, double the original budgeted cost? Well, not full turnkey, new technologies, continual scope changes, changing midway through, change of contractors. I think it's, I think the private sector will deliver quicker, better, faster.
Sure.
But reciprocally, I think the framework has to be ruthless on collusion. So the guys know, if you're going to bid, this is it. To turn around and say, well, small penalties, or, well, that's part of the reason why things are also blocking up. If I was a buyer of services and I've just been cheated out, I'm going to take my time triple checking the next bid I get. We're all the same.
That's
People
normal.
are the same.
Yeah. Okay. So SADC keeps coming up. And you guys were talking about the fact that you have got a lot of these different projects, contracts that people have to go through before they finally arrive at coming up with the project. And yet, when I look at the protocol from SADC itself, and I want to read it here, it says that Protocol on Transport, Communication and Meteorology advises SADC member states to promote, and this is, I think, the key part, an integrated multimodal transport system throughout Southern Africa that remains efficient, reliable, economically viable, and environmentally responsible. Big sounding nice words, but practically in terms of getting those countries to work together. Why is it a problem for Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, South Africa, Angola, Zambia to work together? Where can I go? Lullu, please.
Just as a simple example, if we look at Gauteng, the integrated transport plan that's in place for Gauteng. Again, also, everything sounds great, and I think the bits and pieces are starting to come together, but if you look at the Gautrain and the BRT system, etc. But
so even at the national level,
even on a provincial level, in a metro, it's tough. We're sitting with vast land areas. It's quite different to what you see in Europe. If you travel across South Africa, you always travel across Europe in terms of size. So it's costly, it's complex, it's transport projects, normally public transport takes quite a long time to show any, to get to break-even point, never mind return on investment. So it's complex. We've had, I suppose, certain things that has developed from need, and now to try and that is sustaining a lot of people.
Sure.
And now to try and integrate that in a more formal system is not the easiest way to do, especially given how our cities developed. And it's not only in South Africa; it's in the entire region.
Brunhilde and Mohale, have you guys worked on any regional projects, so coordinated at the SADC level, that have actually been implemented and have worked? Can I start with you?
Yeah, we are involved with SADC, and maybe I'll sort of defend them for today.
Okay.
Because behind the scenes we have a few initiatives with them. As I said, we managing a project preparation fund on behalf of SADC. So the mandate for this fund is to look at regional projects. So we have a few of them.
Okay.
And most
across
of them
all the sectors?
Energy and transport.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's supposed to also cover water, but we haven't had anything in the water sectors yet. So on the
which is a big glaring miss when you talk about SADC and drought.
Yeah, it's something we need to look at.
Sure.
So when we look at the energy side, there are transmission lines, that we're looking at, because we have had lots of power stations being built, and the issue is how do you trade that power within the SADC.
Yes.
So we're looking at a feasibility study, and I think one of the firms here is helping us with that. I won't mention them, represented here.
Okay.
They're helping us with that feasibility study.
They can speak.
Southern African Power Pool,
Yeah.
So that's the SADC initiative. I mean, where you have, the utilities of the region working together, and ensuring that there's evacuation of power across the region.
Sure.
So it's in advanced feasibility. There's also other ones between South Africa and Botswana, also spearheaded by Southern Africa Power Pool. Yeah, so those are the initiatives.
So there are little bits and pieces that are going on.
And more importantly, SADC is also looking at establishing a much bigger fund, called Regional Fund, SADC Regional Fund, to contribute their own funding so that they move these projects much quicker.
Absolutely.
It's another initiative that they are doing here.
Brunhilde?
But where you see the success is the commonality of purpose. Power pool, energy, feeding energy across the region. And I suppose that is the key word when you raised it, is the fact of leadership in a sector for a focused problem and an issue.
And so work is beginning, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and I don't know, I don't want to even try and think about when potentially we might get all the little pieces coming together and getting the region to come together and begin to work as one, and perhaps begin to compete and make Southern Africa a place where businesses want to park their money. And that's where we leave it for our discussion here today on the Build Africa debate, where we're talking about infrastructure and funding and the ways in which we can do it perhaps a little more smartly. Thanks to my guests, Brunhilde Barnard, Infrastructure Leader, EY, Mohale Rakgate, General Manager for Project Preparation, Development Bank of Southern Africa, Raoul Gamsu, CEO, Consolidated Infrastructure Group, and Lullu Krugel, Chief Economist, KPMG South Africa. After the break, we'll return with a panel discussion on the way forward to transforming Africa's agriculture.